Hello, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, episode 19 of the Grind Set stream, Escaping the Moldbug Matrix, part 19. I'm again joined by Logos. Also, welcome Mass Creation Broadcast and Vultra, who seem to be in the chat. So, we'll get back to the grind. Further conversation on regime change, Mungus Moldbug, September 16th, 2007. Beyond the obvious scourge of spam, which bloggers seem to have preserved us from so far, there are a number of ways to moderate a comment section. For example, the most heinous is the Voice of God UI, deployed by such sites as Real Climate, in which the authorities answer the comment quite directly by simply editing it and installing their response in brackets. I should not even mention Real Climate without noting that it's brought to us by the generosity of Environmental Media Services, aka Fenton Communications. On the web, nobody may know you're a dog, but it's never hard to tell who's party organ. Real Climate has developed quite a reputation for simply deleting technical questions that they can't knock out of the park, creating a wonderful impression of omniscience. Needless to say, if I could get away with this, I wouldn't need to blog. I could simply issue orders. Wasn't that interesting, Logos? Remember how I kept saying that a lot of what is driving Moldbug is resentment? He wants to have that power.
Yep.
This kind of seems like him complaining that he doesn't have that power.
Of course.
I thought it would be fun to try to find a new approach in which I stay out of the comment section and instead respond on the main stage. This is only possible because of the continuing high quality of UR's comment brigade. Well, I can't confirm or deny that because the comments are long gone. You can help to maintain this delicate ephemeral state of affairs, dear reader, by sharing this URL only with friends who are at least as intelligent and perceptive as yourself. Let's try this approach on this week's post, which received many excellent comments of a generally critical nature. UR is not, despite all its apparent, a cult. And my gratitude to those who care enough to disagree cannot be repeated too often. You know, Logos, you know what? I would love to put this to the test. Do you think Moldbug would say that about us?
It's a good question. I mean, we're not disagreeing on his blog and his space for his benefit, so maybe not. But maybe if he found some of our things insightful, maybe. I mean, if nothing else, see, here's the thing. We're doing this thing to try to figure out, like, what it is about Moldbug that gets people to like Moldbug. Now, if Moldbug listens to us, he could figure out what it is about his critics that make them not like him. And so he could improve if he applied it symmetrically.
True. So we don't know yet. We'll see. Let's see. And my gratitude to those who care enough to disagree cannot be repeated too often. Of course, if you do agree, I admire your foresight and wisdom, but please don't expect me to spend too much time praising it. Gojimo writes, the diagnosis of systematic dishonesty is sound. The implied prescription remains suspect. For example, I find this suggestion fantastical. Quote, since I believe in separation of information and state, I believe it's very easy for a government to avoid any implications in pseudo-history or pseudoscience. It can simply refuse to care what its citizen thinks and separate itself from any activity that would involve the construction of propaganda of official truth. And then back to the comment. Governments don't engage in propaganda because that's the hardest way to retain sovereignty, but because it's the easiest. Bingo. Government could be honest, invest heavily in the police and military, and face wealth-destroying resentment and occasional violent resistance from various organized idealists who historically killed even in futile efforts. Or a government could divert some of that strongman's budget into opinion control and get an excellent ROI. Fewer police and soldiers required, more cheaper compliance, like co-opted idealists, and less wealth-limiting negative sum conflict. Lying by rulers is adaptive, cheaper, and more efficient than the alternative. You know, Logos, isn't that what we said last week when we read that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It sounded very similar. So props to whoever Gojomo is. This proposition has much to recommend it and is historically associated with the Straussians. Moreover, we can see easily how it leads directly to democracy.
No.
Right, Logos, because, you know, the Tsar totally didn't do that. What do you know?
Yeah.
Totally didn't do that. And neither did the King of France, by the way. Obviously. If convincing one's subjects that your regime is governing in their interests, that it exists only to serve the people, is the pons est sonorum of efficient government, then a regime that does not enjoy popular support is doomed to fall and should receive a gentle shove. Democracy formalizes this process and thus makes it healthier. The only wink link up in the above is the judgment governments don't engage in propaganda because that's the hardest way to retain sovereignty, but because it's the easiest. This may well be true, but it's a military judgment. It is not an observation drawn from human nature, which is relatively constant across history. It is an observation of military reality as it is today, which seems to correlate reasonably well with the real problem of state security in the last 2 or 3 centuries. Now, that's completely idiotic. Like, why do you think Logos in antiquity, we had all of these, like, idols of Zeus and the gods of Olympus, and in the Middle Ages, all these icons of the saints? They knew exactly what they were doing.
Yep.
They had this, like, religious propaganda arm with all of these, like, images and priests and then later, well, pagan priests, but then later, Catholic priests and all that. No, that's stupid. This is just common sense. And that's what truly, well, it's like what Huxley said. You can do everything with a bayonet, but sit on it. And so how do you maintain power and enjoy it?
Well, exactly. It's also a problem, too, because if too many people are unhappy with your government, right? If too many people are unhappy with your government, you get revolution. You don't need democracy to formalize the process. They don't need it. They revolt and they overthrow the government. French Revolution did it. 1917, Russia did it. Happens all the time throughout history. People don't like it. They revolt. So if you're the government, you say, wow, a critical mass of people might not like what we're doing. Are you going to A, be honest, or B, misdirect and keep enough people on the fringes that don't like what the government's doing for different reasons that none of them unify to make a revolution against the government? And that explains our current climate in America.
Yep. Military judgments change as the military realities change. Military realities change as military technology changes. It's hard to know what people will invent in the future, but let's try and re-examine this judgment with respect to the technological reality of 2007. 1, the difficulty of crowd control is vastly overrated. First, as the example of China demonstrates so well, the historicist assumption that any regime which orders its troops to fire on a mob has lost the mainland of heaven and is doomed is questionable at best. Well, that was true in 1917 Russia. By the time they shot at the people, it was already too late. This assumption is deeply intertwined with the mystical logic of democracy. Every democracy on earth has its martyrdom legend in which a mob of its revolutionary supporters was fired on. If we're looking for democratic pseudo history, we need look no further. Well, I mean, again, this is just nonsense. That's how the Russian Revolution happened. I mean, when you have to shoot your subjects, you've already lost.
Yep.
This should be obvious, but we are also dealing with Moldbug. In fact, the military advantage of soldiers over rioters has been increasingly steady for the last 200 years and continues to do so. Investing heavily is not required. A few loyal units with crew-served weapons and an adequate ammunition supply can defeat any mob. Furthermore, non-lethal crowd control technology continues to advance. Okay, 1. What if the soldiers switch sides? Right. That's usually how a successful revolution happens. 2, what kind of a psychopath just invents this tower defense game to then kill all the peasants that run through it? Like, that's not political science. That's not rulership.
Exactly.
That's insane. I didn't know what to say. 2, the real problem with effective crowd control is maintaining the loyalty of the military.
There you go.
Yeah, the subject is covered quite well in Professor Lutlock's wonderful Coup d'etat, a practical handbook, given the advantage of military over non-military forces. Whoever controls the army controls the government. Well, you see, that's not true, though. As we saw with guerrilla insurgencies in China, which led to the fall of Chiang Kai-shek, in Vietnam, which led to the defeat of the French and United States, as we saw the Taliban in Afghanistan, insurgents win. Like, bro, now he wrote this in 2007, so we already had China and Vietnam under the belt, and then Afghanistan for the Russians. So,
yeah,
right. It's not like peasants versus the army. It's actually going to be insurgents versus the army. And conventional forces have a lot of challenges when dealing with unconventional force. I mean, that's why the U.S. lost in Afghanistan. In the past, ensuring military loyalty was tricky and human problem with no easy solutions. For example, foreign mercenaries are more likely to be effective in crowd control. Okay, this is actually one time where Moldbug is saying something sensible. I've been saying this for a long time, and it's true. They are also more likely to turn on you and capture your state. At Tiananmen, the PLA used forces from remote parts of China who felt relatively little personal sympathy for the students of Beijing. Very effective approach, but not one which is always available. One way to describe the importance of popular support to military loyalty, despite the almost complete military irrelevance of unarmed forces, is to see control of the military as a coordination game and public opinion as its shelling point. Military loyalty is a coordination game because in a situation of conflicting military loyalty, the personal advantage of siding with the winning team is likely to be considerable. However, 21st century technologies made or at least should make this problem obsolete. The solution is to supplement personal loyalty with cryptographic weapon locks as used today on nuclear weapons. In the world of modern networking, there is no reason at all why this approach cannot extend all the way down to small arms. When lawful authority is married to digital security as it is today with nuclear football, coups become impossible. Loyal forces will find that their weapons operate. Disloyal units might as well be wielding super soakers. Okay, this is insane, Logos. Where do I want to start with this?
I don't know. Where do you want to start with this?
You can't put digital locks on small arms. Where is this coming from? And like, what about the black market?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, ghost guns are really upending this.
Like, what is he talking about? This is insane. Cryptographic weapon locks. How are you going to put a cryptographic weapon lock on an AR-15? You want it? Is he going to explain that?
Well, I mean, there are some locks that you can put. I mean, there are trigger locks, for example, where you have to have a key or a code or something to get the thing to stop blocking the trigger so you can fire the weapon. But you can eventually you can saw them off. You can
Yep.
If you're tenacious enough, you can get them off. What they're trying to do is like they're like fingerprint locks on guns.
Yes.
That'll like stop you from pulling the trigger unless your fingerprint's registered, and that's like built into the gun itself.
Yeah, but what about all the guns that are already in circulation before?
That's the problem. Yeah, that's the problem.
Especially in a place like the United States.
Yes. I mean,
Because
if they try to do it with new guns, if they try to make a law doing that with new guns, I think the revolt would happen before the first shipment of guns really landed. Because
dude, people would be like, "This is New World Order. This is like the Antichrist. Go to the barricades now."
Exactly. Yep.
Like, what is this? I mean, no, disloyal units are going to have black market guns. What are you talking about? Like, Moldbug is the same kind of person who's going to tell you that arms control is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
He is, right? He's going to go full Lolbert and say, well, gun control is impossible, guys. What are you going to do about that? And it's like, well, okay, what's this?
He strikes me that way. I mean, the only thing I can think of is, yeah, it can't always extend all the way down to small arms. And I might be saying like tanks, helicopters, military things like that can be coded in such a way that only loyal people can fly them. But then it just gets down to the insurgency problem. It's like, yes, tanks, helicopters, and stuff can hold ground, but determined people with AR-15s can assassinate people while they sleep. Like, so that's the thing about asymmetric warfare.
Yes. No, I don't know. Let's look at what a shelling point is. In game theory is a solution that people tend to choose by default in the absence of communication. A focal point. Okay. So it's just game theory. Yeah, but the problem is whenever the United States applies game theory to geopolitics, it loses. We applied game theory in Afghanistan. Well, it turns out the Taliban didn't play the same game we did. Turns out the Viet Cong didn't play the same game we did.
Yeah, I mean, I can say from experience studying game theory in graduate school, the way that solutions to games were interpreted by the book, the instructor, and so on were odd. Like, I would get into arguments with my instructor about alternate solutions to games and explain how these alternate points manifest. And he's just like, huh, you're kind of right about that. And he'd give me full credit, even though I didn't get the right answer, so to speak.
I don't know why people have this like autism like blinkers. It's like one of those horses from like the 19th century. They had like those black guards so they couldn't see to either side. It's like people are just wearing those all the time. And I'm just like, take them off.
Yeah.
And again, once military loyalty is assured, crowd control is a trivial problem. The era of mob rule is over. It just doesn't know it yet. Womp womp. 2011 logos. What happened in 2011?
2011? Wait, say that again?
Do you remember what happened in 2011?
No. What happened in
Arab
2011?
Spring.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, but mob rule's over, guys. It's over. Like,
True.
What is this? Where does this come from? This is insane.
Well, this is also interesting too, because like mob rule is over, but yet Mustache Man and all the other people were supposedly like demotist or democratic, as Moldbug would even call them. And so, you know, they weren't really formalists. They ruled with the mob. Well, I mean, when exactly did mob rule end? I don't understand like when that was supposed to have happened, given how recent some of these regimes were in human history.
I think specifically mob rule in this context of this particular essay is sort of like flash mobs you see develop on the street. Because he specifically mentions Tiananmen Square.
Got it.
But that's still insane. Because like 2011, like all of these governments just fell due to flash mobs.
Yeah, he could have said something like mob rule is over in sufficiently developed Western countries or something like that. But even then, I mean, in more recent time, look at the BLM riots and stuff like that. Now, you can take one of two ways about it. You can either assume that our government just didn't want to stop them because they were, you know, better for our government, or our government was unable to stop them, in which case that flash mob rule wasn't really...
Well, there's another even more obvious example, the complete collapse of the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah.
Like, not a single shot was, quote, fired by anybody in Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, but the whole thing fell apart due to mass social protests.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is he talking about?
The Orange Revolution in Ukraine?
That was 2005, so yeah.
Yeah.
Dude.
So he has to mean sufficiently developed Western countries.
But the Soviet Union was a highly developed country.
Yeah, well, okay. A post 2000s digitized developed Western country?
I mean, maybe, but as you pointed out, we had, you know, the BLM riots.
Right. So either he has to say that the government is in on it, in which case that would certainly be him getting off the fence, or he'd have to say that the government wanted to stop it but couldn't. And
well, that's well, because here's the thing, right? But this is why I brought up the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet military in 1991 was the world's largest standing military.
Yeah.
And it was completely powerless to stop the revolution. So, because here's what Moldbug is not understanding. You can actually compete with a totalitarian state by looking at the threat thresholds. And this is sort of what I've been getting at with my theory of the video I did last year entitled, grabbing on to the softest strength from the Tao.
Right.
If you have a plan that can subtly undermine the entire position of a totalitarian state, and then you implement it below the threat threshold where they can justify shooting you in the streets, you bring them down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what happened from 1988 to 1991.
Yep.
So, dude, it doesn't even matter. You could envision a scenario where all of the guns are on cyberlock and the regime still falls because nobody's willing to pull the triggers because the threat threshold isn't sufficient for... I mean, it's going to take a cold-blooded killer to just gun down all of his, friends and family and relatives to protect the government.
Well, even with crowd control technology, right? We're developing non-lethal means of crowd control: flashbangs, lights, heat beams that just like make people burn but don't like really physically hurt them. Pepper spray, mass pepper spray gas, things like that. Like we have better and better crowd control technologies all the time. But I think the issue is if a sufficiently large amount of people get out and you start pepper spraying them, then you basically lose all legitimacy unless you have enough soldiers to make sure that people follow your will all the time. But you basically signaled that.
Yeah, but we know that won't work either, right? Because think about how in the South during the 60s protests against Jim Crow, They use non-lethal force. They use fire hoses, but look how that blew up in their face.
Well, exactly. That's the point. Yeah. Once you start doing stuff like that, you've basically cemented yourself as adversarial with a large chunk of the population. Like, even the people staying home and aren't coming to the protest, if they look at how you handle the protest, what it'll signal to them is, wow, what if I have an issue? Well, this is how they're going to handle me. And so nobody trusts the government for anything at that point. Everybody tries to undermine them, use black markets, however which way they can. And the government isn't a social institution any longer. It's something else.
By the way, this article really cements my idea that Moldbug just wants to run the East India Company.
I bet.
I mean, that's what it sounds like to me, but we'll keep going. 3, perhaps most important propaganda, pseudohistory and pseudoscience, is an epiphenomena of the 19th and 20th century information technology, which gives strong advantages to broadcast designs. Womp, womp. So Logos, our history of the church that we're going through. I wonder when the propaganda about all that early history started coming down the pipe.
Yeah, no kidding.
And how effective has that propaganda been?
Exceptionally effective. You don't need broadcasts. Moldbug said it's a cathedral, stupid. It's Moldbug's entire point. All you need is to control the ways which people get information. So as long as the right clergy know what the right narrative is, and they tell their congregation about it in the cathedral or whatever, your message will get out there. You don't need to broadcast to everybody at once. You just need to control what is broadcast, which is actually easier to do pre-broadcast, not harder.
Yes. Actually, it's a lot harder now. Well, it is and it isn't. As of 2007 on, it got really hard for the government to control the narrative.
Right.
As of 2020, this came up in my discussion with Charlie and Dave. It's complicated because on the one hand, they're still losing control of the script after 2020.
Yep.
But they're also getting some people to double down. So it's a little confusing right now.
Yeah.
From broadcast propaganda works. For almost 3 decades of my life, I was completely confident that the New York Times was presenting me with a complete and generally accurate perspective of reality. Pseudohistory and pseudoscience, when forced to confront reason on a level playing field, tend to lose. At least they lose in the minds of reasonable, intelligent people. And on a level playing field, it is not too hard for reasonable and intelligent people to identify each other and act effectively and collectively. Wow, that has aged like crap, hasn't it, Lucas? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't it so easy to find reasonable and intelligent people, Logos? I mean, they're just everywhere, right?
Everywhere, all the time.
So easy. Worse, the outcome has very little relationship to the massive force deployed. A very few reasonable people can defeat a giant horde of brainwashed flacks. What is he talking about? What? Like, what does that even mean, Logos?
I have no idea.
The latter, again, might as well be armed with super soldiers. You know what I think? You know what? I got it, Logos. You know what this is? This is the pseudo-history of science, right? Because science is just what happens when really smart people get together and try to figure out what the truth is. And they just had all these W's over mysticism and superstition. That's where it's coming from. What do you want to bet?
Maybe.
If you accept this proposition, which I've only just begun trying to demonstrate, that pseudohistory and pseudoscience are widespread in the present Western institutions of education and journalism, the appearance of a level playing field, peer-to-peer packet networking, aka this little thing called the internet, creates an impressive disequilibrium. It's possible to unlevel the field by filtering the internet, but effective internet filtering is not easy. Well, it's been done now, Logos. So, worse, the success of pseudohistory and pseudoscience is not just a result of the fact that it's easy to filter broadcast information systems. It's the result of the fact that it's easy to create subtly filtered broadcast information systems, which don't appear to be in the business of managing public opinion on behalf of the security forces, but in fact are doing just that. This level of plausible deniability is simply unachievable on the internet. I mean, Logos, what can you even say to this nonsense?
Sorry, I missed it. It sounded like a riot was going on in my front yard. I just got back. What did I miss?
This level of plausible deniability is simply unachievable on the internet.
What?
Oh, I'll reread it. You missed it. It's possible to unlevel the field by filtering the internet, but effective internet filtering is not easy. Worse, the success of pseudohistory and pseudoscience is not just the result of the fact that it's easy to filter broadcast information systems. It's the result of the fact that it's easy to create subtly filtered broadcast information systems, which don't appear to be in the business of managing public opinion on behalf of the security forces, but in fact are doing just that.
Yes.
This level of plausible deniability is simply unachievable on the internet.
What? What?
I can't imagine how it could possibly be done.
Wow.
It hurts, Logos. It really hurts.
I bet.
I mean, Logos, how did somebody this colossally stupid get to be the dominant thinker of the right for like 10 years?
I don't know. It was a prediction. I wouldn't call him that stupid over that. He said,
Logos, it's as of 2007, this was already universal. I was going up against it everywhere. This sort of like filtering for the regime on the internet without actually being a part of the regime, obviously.
Yeah, I mean,
it was everywhere.
It was
everywhere,
yeah. Well, because it's the same thing. It's the same thing that the spooks have been doing since the 70s. Find popular revolutionary figures hip with the kids and get them on message. And it's just as the platforms have changed, they've just been doing it. So,
right. Therefore, my conclusion is that if the 20th century Western information systems are indeed contaminated with pseudohistory and/or pseudoscience, the disequilibrium is unsustainable and regime change in the medium term is inevitable. Jewish atheist writes, therefore, my reboot test is that a government should be rebooted if it systematically and successfully promotes essential pseudoscience or pseudohistory. I cannot believe any government on earth could pass this test. We'd be rebooting more than Windows 95. Nor do I see why it should be grounds for rebooting. The only justification I see in this post is I simply see no reason at all to tolerate this kind of crap. I'm not sure that qualifies. Also, it seems to me that in order to effect a reboot, it would be necessary to convince a majority of the population that the government had engaged in pseudohistory, pseudoscience, or pseudohistory. But if you can convince the population of that in a democracy, you've already solved the problem. I cannot believe any government on earth could pass this test either, which is why the issue strikes me as significant, as for more often than Windows 95. I suspect you are referring implicitly to the same argument that Gojamo makes above. It's very interesting that a thinker such as yourself, who, if I'm not projecting too much, seems quite comfortable in accepting continuity with 200 years of revolutionary democratism from the philosophers to Hillary, all aimed at freeing your mind so your ass will follow, would gravitate to the Straussian line that the government without propaganda is physically impossible. If I simply see no reason at all to tolerate this kind of crap strikes you as short on gravitas, perhaps a visit to the Jefferson Memorial will refresh your memory. My alignment is lawful neutral, hence I try to keep a good distance from the altar of God, especially when swearing. It reminds me of the time I sacrificed a dead elf on the altar of whatever that is, which didn't work out well at all, but I certainly concur with the general sentiment. As for convincing the majority of the population, yes, that's one way to trigger a reboot. In fact, today's world, it may well be the only way. The practicality of a military coup seems low at present, though of course these things can always change. But my interest is in answering the question of what the dog should do when it catches the car. Certainly the likes of, say, Newt Gingrich didn't turn out to have a good answer. At present, the power of public opinion is considerable, but it is only useful if it's focused on achieving a desirable and specific result. The tremendous looseness and vagueness of today's political coalitions, especially in the US and Britain, effectively defeats the aclarchic form of democracy and maintains the present mediocratic form. Using democratic mechanisms to achieve a major structural change in the state, such as a reboot, by definition involves a reactivity of aclarchy, aka mob politics. Well, wait a minute, Logos. If just democracy now is mob politics, and America's a democracy as of 2007, well, then clearly the age of mob rule isn't over.
That's a good point.
I'm confused, Logos. Is mob rule democracy, or is it a flash mob on the streets in Tiananmen Square?
Exactly. Yep.
I know.
Because if mob rule is just democracy, it turns out that our government's been keeping a good amount of power for decades by lying to people instead of being truthful, like Moldbug said. And therefore, the age of mob rule isn't over. Now, if democracy isn't mob rule, then I don't know why Moldbug insists on calling democracy the formalization of mob rule.
Good point. This is dangerous. So is a military coup. There is no non-dangerous way to accomplish any significant political change. By safe, I suppose what I mean was safe in the FDA sense of the word, that is, as safe as possible. Daniel Nagy writes, in my experience, the only reasons for a populace to demand regime change are substantially lower living standards than those in recent memory or those that it came to expect. Yeah, that's absolutely what happens. This is an absolute necessity, though not sufficient condition for a successful reboot. As long as people are reasonably prosperous by their own standards, most of them oppose regime change. I mean, I agree. I think Daniel's right. What do you think, Logos?
Yeah, seems obvious to me.
Were the regime changes of 1989 really associated with a drop in living standards? And what about 1789? Well, yeah, in 1789 there was a famine in France, so yes, in part.
Yes.
It's certainly true that this correlation... Well, and again, what do you mean by living standards? Right? If you're losing your rights, then that is a reduction in living standards in the modern age.
Also, living standards could be relative. So, like, the entire point of the Berlin Wall was to keep, East Germans and East Germany and so on, keep the freedom of movement limited. Don't let people interact too much. It's why you're not allowed to escape North Korea, right? But once you have enough information technology that can get through to show people what life's like outside the state, then if your relative cost of living looks like it's gone down relative to the rest of the world, then it could be the same thing. Yeah. I want what they got.
Yeah, it's certainly true that this correlation is held in a number of cases, and it's true that you need some pressing source of rage and political estrangement, but I can think of many such. Michael V. writes, quote, the question is among what social or professional circles it is more fashionable to be a conservative than a progressive. The answer is the energy industry, the agricultural industry, the military, the salvationist religious community, and pretty much nowhere else. You missed finance, Mencius, big miss. Combine that with real estate development and medicine, where the fashion benefits is more moderate. And oh yeah, everything associated with food and industry. And you're taking a majority of the economy in the society, even ignoring the items you mentioned. Exxon could, if you wanted to, buy control of all the Ivies, but that wouldn't support the bottom line. Well, but Exxon did buy all the Ivies, right, Logos?
It did. Yep.
No, this is actually interesting, right? Because as of 2007, Michael is sort of right. It was more fashionable to be quote-unquote a conservative in many of those industries. But not anymore.
Well, that's true. I think there's something interesting in that argument, right? Exxon could, if it wanted to, buy control of all the Ivies. But do these big firms have to buy control of the Ivies? Or do they just have to get a controlling stake in the grant-making process?
That too. And, yeah. I think, and then Moldbug, I think you're thinking of social and professional circles in which conservatives are tolerated. It's true that in some areas of finance and medicine surgery, it's acceptable and normal to be someone who voted for George W. Bush. It's also true that in all these areas, it's acceptable and normal to be someone who voted for John Kerry. Who, for example, is the anti-George Soros? Warren Buffett? Buffett, son of great Howard Buffett, is donating his entire fortune to the generally liberal Gates Foundation. BTW, I don't know where you work, but I know where Byron works, and I'll take his word on this one. When you look for social and professional circles in which progressive opinions are considered weird and disturbing and their holders make a conscious effort to avoid admitting to them in the workplace, you have to move more steps away from anything that even resembles social influence. You're probably right, for example, about real estate developers. Real estate developers influence one set of individuals in the next generation, children of real estate developers, and even then probably want to distance themselves a little if they have a clue. Exxon could do no thing to affect the opinions of Ivy League professors or students. Where's this coming from?
I don't know.
Frankly, it would have been better luck trying to take over the Catholic Church. This literally happened.
It happened. It absolutely happened.
I know. We're living downstream from it. It happened. So, I don't know. George Weinberg writes, I'm going to have to go along with the others. The essential lie criterion of reboot is a crock. In the vast majority of societies which have existed, whether one was a ruler or ruled was pretty much irrevocably fixed at birth, and this was well known. So because it's not a secret, the ruled should regard this as a right. That makes no sense. It seems to me that the pragmatic criteria should be 1, are you sure you can pull it off? And 2, are you sure you'll be better off afterwards? Bearing in mind the potential consequences of being wrong. When the Estates General was first called, the French nobility thought the result would be a decrease in the monarch's power and an increase in their own. When one is wrong, sometimes there is nothing to be done but to shrug one's shoulders. I think the ideas of an essential lie is peculiar to democracies, or at least to societies which pretend to be democracies. Coming from anyone, I'd say this objection to being lied to sounds like a moral indignation, trumping practical considerations. Are you sure it isn't? Because it's okay if it is. Well, no, because the idea that you need to have a lie at the start of the state comes from Plato, and Plato's Callipolis is not a democracy.
True.
So there's that. It is, and I think 1 and 2 are obvious questions to ask before considering any sort of regime change. I've certainly spent quite a bit of time justifying 2. No one can justify an ought based on an is. Logos. We've been here before.
Have we?
Well, not with Moldbug, but in other contexts.
Oh, yeah.
I could argue that over time, regimes which are based on essential lie are unstable and hence dangerous. And as I certainly believe this, however, I do object to being lied to, and since I live in a democracy, or at least a society which pretends to be a democracy, I'm not alone in this. If you want to know why I consider 1 not beyond the reach of plausibility, perhaps this is my answer. M. Travin writes, whatever force is sufficient to effect a reboot of government has to be at least as strong as the current government, and this is likely to be just as problematic as what it replaces. The new one will be uncorrupt in your definition. Why exactly? Because you prefer it that way? Lustration will remove all the corrupted and corruptors and replace them with the shiny new class of honest rulers. Where do these honest souls come from, and what prevents them from becoming what they replaced? I refer you to my discussion on neocameralism. Either you buy it or you don't. But the crucial point is that a government whose legitimacy has consequence of property rights, not public opinion, has no reason to maintain public opinion or otherwise deceive its residents, and plenty of reason not to. I mean, again, that's BS, right? If you look at, go back to Hoppe. What's a monarchy? It's private government, right? It's property rights. It's owned by the king. Why do they have all this pageantry? Why do they have all these, organized religions? Because they can't rule with a bayonet completely. They have to overawe the population.
Yep.
I mean, this is so insane. Like, how can you read a history book on the Russian Empire and not come to the conclusion that that's how they maintain power? It's obvious.
I don't know what world he thinks people live in, where they're just going to be like, oh, well, it's the ruler's property. We're just the ruler's property. We're just not going to do anything, guys. We're the ruler's property. I know life's getting more and more terrible every year, but there's no point at which we do something about it because, we're all just property, I guess.
I have no idea. I know. It's just so wrong on so many levels. Stud Beef Pile writes, the more interesting question is how MM as a good formalist can support revolution. I knew someone would ask this. Thank you, Stud. The point of formalism is to move from disorder to order and stay there. In general, this involves recognizing and legitimizing existing power structures. You mean like Logos, like legitimizing and defending the PRC? Because I mean, obviously, it would be more chaotic to get rid of it, right?
Yeah.
However, in cases where systematic deception is an essential aspect of the existing power structure, convincing it to formalize itself may be extremely difficult. For example, it may not even believe that it's a power structure. In these cases, there may be no alternative to reboot or some other form of peaceful but effective regime change. Randy writes, the basic problem, as I see, is that this government equals corruption. As the anarcho-capitalists are so fond of pointing out, an entirely voluntary government wouldn't need to be a government at all. And as all elements of government that are not voluntary are corruption, government equals corruption, does it make sense to reboot the corruption in order to establish a new order of corruption? Then neither does it make sense to reboot government. However, what does make sense is to downsize government corruption. And the way to do that is to take each element one at a time and find a way to make them voluntary. Well, I mean, that was a pile of crap that never happened, was it, Logos?
Uh-huh.
This is not quite how I see it. The way I see is that the government equals sovereignty plus corruption, where government means government as we know it today. Sovereignty means self-enforced property ownership, and corruption means deception as an outdoor sport. You know what's interesting? So this is something that I think what's interesting about Moldbug here is I remember hearing from like Noam Chomsky back in the day that, anarcho-capitalism would be terrible. It would be total tyranny because you'd be, ruled by these unaccountable corporations. And I feel like Moldbug is just like this is like his his Jordan Peterson moment. Yes, Chomsky, I am that evil private tyrant. He's like, I'm going to own this.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that what it sounds like?
Yep. Well, which is interesting, right? Because some people are up in arms about his recent interview. Your values don't matter, only power.
Huh. You know who said that? You know who said that, Logos?
Who?
Lenin.
Did he?
Lenin just cared about getting power. Like, he used to argue with all the socialists, saying, "Oh, stop being soft-headed socialists. We just must take the power."
That's funny.
Okay. The problem with anarcho-capitalism, as I see it, is that the anarcho-capitalists seem awfully keen on eliminating sovereignty, which equates to creating a vacuum of power, which creates an unstable power dynamic, which is hence dangerous. Neo-cameralism is different in that it accepts sovereignty, but aims to strip it of the mystical claptrap in which it has always sought, generally successfully, to clothe itself. You know what, Logos? As if Lockean property rights is not mystical claptrap.
Uh-huh.
Funny how you can play this game of pseudo-history, huh, Logos?
Yep.
Turning to some actual positive feedback, B. Broadside writes, one argument against the reboot can be applied to almost any proposal for political reform. If the power to make this reform exists, how come it hasn't happened yet? This isn't particularly original, nor is it easily dismissed. URs about selling ideas of limited government to a new audience. What? Wait, Finargo has absolute power. What is this?
It's absolute power. What are we talking about here?
Selling them democratically out of the Libertarian Party hasn't worked, and UR argues it can't work. So stop asking people to give up power and sell them on a new way of using their power, coming forward, being honest about what they're doing, and punishing them when they fail to do so. I suspect any workable solution involves a bit of both approaches. Convincing people to give up power always does. It involves persuading them to use what is left of their power to ensure an outcome that they will find satisfactory, typically by presenting them with an alternative that is even less desirable from their perspective. I haven't talked much about the libertarian experience with democratic politics. To me, the basic problem, which is basically insolvable, is that libertarianism and democracy are basically inconsistent. Judicially limited government simply doesn't work, nor does any other approach of limiting government by separating or opposing powers. So, well, yeah, but we could just say by the same token that centralizing power never works because it always slips through their fingers. Remember Nicholas?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, keep going. So libertarians cannot preserve a realistic picture of a world in which their battles get won and stay won. They wind up looking for ways to push a world in which the state's natural downhill path is to grow back up the hill. The prospect is Sisyphean, and it's understandable why it attracts so few supporters. From the same source, does the illustration extend to the military? I'm just curious because it seems like you've spoken favorably of martial law. And in any case, the loss of experience which would come from kicking out all lieutenants and generals would seem pretty severe. On the other hand, maybe by old regime, you only mean the blue government, in which case the old security forces could stick around as long as they took care to separate themselves from the information providers. My goal, of course, is to kick out the blue government because this is the government that has the real power. That is the government that manages public opinion. Obviously, in a coup situation, this is how it would go down. For a democratic reboot, it would depend on the power structure. You see, this is what's really frustrating here, Logos. So he's going to say that the blue government has the power, but we just read earlier that these blue functionaries are getting funded by who? By George Soros, by other rich people. So wait a minute, who's upstream all the way, Logos?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, the financial elites, the ones that he's shilling for. And yet they're the ones that are paying for these movements that he doesn't like. So how does that work? You got to keep Warren Buffett and George Soros around?
Well, they technically he's going to want to make them in charge of government. If they're the ones who truly have the power, then
and they run the corporations.
Yeah, then
Oh, boy.
he'd make them de facto leaders of the government.
Well, doesn't that just make the government blue forever then?
Yeah, I guess so, but I guess they're going to be responsible blue government. I don't know.
Like his whole argument just falls apart.
It kind of does. I mean, it's not even like making them de facto responsible for what's going on. It's going to help. I mean, how many places do we have blue leadership in like cities and places all over the country that are like destroying themselves? And the fact that you know who the mayor of Seattle is, or the governor of Oregon is, or the state legislatures of California, it doesn't matter because the
Well, look, go back to the very top. He said, okay, I don't like real climate change. And then it's brought to us by the generosity of Environmental Media Services, aka Fenton Communications. Yeah, I know. It's a private company that's donating to real climate change. How do you not figure this out, Moldbug? And I mean, he would just make Fenton Communications in charge, which means he's going to get guaranteed real climate change without any voice.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know. It's worth noticing, however, that for every lieutenant or general, there are several retired lieutenants and generals. And the Pentagon being what it is, I suspect that often these are actually the best people. Dude, Logos, 2007. This was the surge. This was when Iraq had gone to crap. What is he talking about?
No idea.
I mean, Iraq was a dumpster fire. Like for the last, from like 2003 to the surge, we had lost control of the country.
Ooh, this Byrne guy is asking a good question. How do you segregate government from the polygon? That's exactly what we were talking about.
Yeah. Can a former member of the government edit a newspaper? Can he write a blog? Can he manage a campaign? If it's literally members of the government who are forced out, wouldn't every major political poll just switch job titles with this campaign manager and return to the status quo? I think you need more than a bit. You need an influence quotient that measures the correlation between someone's opinion and subsequent policy. Dude, this way of thinking is so brain damaged. I hate it. Because how did Trump get how did he win in 2016? Because all of this polling correlating crap doesn't work. That's why.
Yep.
Why would anybody think this is an accurate reflection of reality is beyond me. It's beyond me. I can't understand it. So I probably have an IQ of like -0.8, and Ted Kennedy has an IQ of 0.9. If you want this to work, you either have to have a cutoff, nobody in the government without an IQ below 0.5, or tax, you lose 10K, and 1 vote for every 0.1 of IQ above 0. I like your IQ, but it's too algorithmic and it's not legalistic enough. Constructing the databases would be an enormous and subjective task. Here's how you illustrate, I think. 1, identify all organizations which are considered part of the old regime. This is likely to include many nominally private organizations, such as newspapers, universities, etc. Step 1 is the hard part because it's inevitably subjective and has to be a personal decision. A good guideline is that the organization is subsidized or accredited by the state. But this is by no means a hard and fast rule. 2, dissolve all these organizations and perhaps after a short cooling off period, publish off their internal files. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. Imagine what's in the cabinet at the NYT or the Harvard admissions office. 3, identify all employees of these organizations. This is a matter of public record. If nothing else, it can be done from their HR files. 4, publish an official list of these employees and declare them ineligible for employment in the new government or any contractor thereof. Moreover, they can do whatever the heck they like. Can the former editors of the New York Times start a group blog called the New York Times in Exile? Of course they can. They're welcome to. They will have to establish their credibility by what they say, just like the rest of us. I mean,
that's not going to solve the problem. I mean, the reason the New York Times is so trusted is because it's got a lot of big money and influence backing it. So if all these people just run to start a new blog or whatever back by the same rich assholes, then there you go. It just resets itself instantly.
Yep. It does. Okay. Since some people seem to still think I'm exaggerating this stuff, I'm just Moldbug, September the 17th, 2007. From an essay by Robert Weisberg, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at UIUC. My experience is probably typical and thus the fear of giving offense consigns thousands of graduates to incomplete educations. Sort of like proper Victorian sex ed. A victorious cycle is created, safe lectures beget boredom, and this only encourages yet more sleeping and more groveling. This censoring can also have more tragic consequences for those oblivious to awaiting minefields. I have a distinguished colleague, Stuart Nagel, who is a tale worth telling. He taught public policy and one day explained that black businesses in Kenya were uncompetitive against the Indian-run enterprises since blacks were too generous in granting credit to friends and family. He had been invited by the government of Kenya to study the situation and suggest better business training for black Kenyans. This topic was indisputably part of the course and thus totally protected by AAUP, academic speech guidelines. Stewart was also extremely liberal on all racial issues. Nevertheless, to condense a long story, an anonymous letter from an irritated black student complained of Nagel's racism and included the preposterous charge of workplace violence. After a protracted and bungled internal university investigation, 2 federal trials, I testified at one, he was stripped of his teaching responsibilities and coerced into retirement. Interestingly, having been charged as a racist, his departmental colleagues, save 2 conservatives, abandoned him. A few years later, partially as a result of this emotionally and financially draining incident, $100,000 out of a pocket for legal fees, he committed suicide. I can only speculate that he believed that years spent being a good liberal, including service in the Justice Department and Civil Rights Division, would insulate him from being denounced as a racist. Nor would he have anticipated that the university would spend the hundreds of thousands in legal fees to punish a famous tenured faculty professor who offended 2 students. Nagel said saga undoubtedly provided useful lessons to many others. Stupidity can really be dangerous even in the university. Better keep it quiet. We now know you to mean the menace of global warming. This entire story is very relevant in light of what we've seen in the last 5 years, Logos.
Oh, yeah, basically.
So I'm like, yeah, how many people, Logos, whether they were doctors, whether they were progressives who didn't get the latest beta update, or like, wait, I'm out of step. I'm the quack. I'm the racist. I can't believe this. Believe it. Okay. Is journalism official? Just Moldbug, September 19th, 2007. Readers may have noticed that where most writers of my general ilk would refer to the mainstream media, I prefer to refer to the official press. The second half of this eccentricity is easy to explain. At the age of 12, I returned to America from a strange foreign parts and was promptly thrust into what was supposedly one of the best public high schools in Maryland. If this is so, I have no reason to doubt it. God save Maryland. The school had been built in 1971 around the then fashionable open school fad in the teaching area in which some crude, ramshackle partitions had been constructed, although room would still be an overstatement. Swept in a great semicircle around the heart of the building, a large wall-less library, because there could be no barriers to learning. Except it wasn't called a library, it was called a media center. And for the first month or 2 of my weird, disorienting experience in this appalling primate facility, I struggled to figure out where the media center was and what it was, and why everyone thought the question was so funny. Since then, I've had a profound allergy to the word M. Moreover, I find McLuhan's ridiculous, jejune, and sophomoric. Moreover, considering the dignity of the intuition and considering the comical sound of our phrases like freedom of the media, I prefer the old term. It's true that the New York Times is no longer printed by ink comparison, and CNN is not printed at all, nor does a cable modem modulate or demodulate. Somehow we managed the deal. We are left with that other word, official. Is journalism official? Because if journalism is official, we know exactly what it is. A journalist is an official writer, a member of the Union of Writers. If he writes for the Times, he may even be a member of the Central Committee of the Union of Writers. In our democratic society, the official press is entrusted with important social responsibility of informing the public. Therefore, not just any poor schmuck can tell us what George W. Bush said today. No, it takes a journalist. You know, the whole journalism in crisis I've been hearing about for the last 10 years, I'm surprised that, Moldbug didn't see that coming.
Agree.
Because, if he's right about the digital society, that is going to lead to the end of journalism, and it did. In the sense if he's criticizing it as of 2007.
Yeah.
Of course, this is consistent with the polygon hypothesis that power in the modern democracies belongs to those who manage public opinion. This hypothesis is actually not mine. I believe it was first stated by Walter Lippmann. Dude, I've been dropping Lippmann this whole time, Logos.
Yep, but he's done it a couple times too.
And in his book about that name, and Lippmann did quite a bit to push the system into practice. The Polygon is not so crude as to have a name or mailing address. It is a movement, not a conspiracy. But if it did have a name and address, it would be the Inquiry, and its address would be 68th and Park. Well, but see, that's the point. The system that Lippmann set up isn't a democracy. And that's something that many on the far left have said. So again, this is where Moldbug just doesn't make sense. Like, what is it, right? Is it a democracy or not? Because, I mean, we know what he's going to say, so. The key to the Polygon hypothesis is that the three words are synonyms: responsibility, influence, and power. The New York Times, for example, is responsible because if it does the wrong thing rather than the right thing, it can cause a great deal of suffering. It is influential because its actions affect the lives of many people, and it is powerful because there is no conceivable meaningful sense of the English word power, which is not synonymous with responsibility and influence. Power is the ability to make a difference, to change the world. Remind me again what people say on their J-School applications. For example, who is the most powerful man in the United States? There's an easy way for me to answer that question. I can ask which American I would prefer if I had to choose one and only one to magically convert into a fanatical and unquestioning disciple of you are. Obviously, my plans for the new improved America involve a level of social change that would boggle the mind of even the most diversity-addled Yale freshman. Who would be the best individual to carry out this program? No, the answer isn't particularly dependent on the extremist ideology, neocameralism, communism, NS, whatever. Suppose to narrow the question slightly, I chose between George W. Bush, Warren Buffett, Rupert Murdoch, and author Alex Schulzberger Jr. Which of these four individuals has more capacity to create change? Well, if it's me, Logos, I'd pick Warren Buffett. What about you?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Though I don't know who Arthur Schulzberger Jr. is, so I can't say. I guess on that part. For example, when we equate power with influence and responsibility, we can see especially that George W. Bush is almost powerless. Our decider is often presented with decisions which have been carefully pre-spun to ensure the correct outcome. He is treated as a sort of chimp-eared magic 8-ball. He cannot even write his own speeches. If he came to his staff with a policy idea, one which he had come up with himself, their first thought would probably be to send him for an MRI. Carlyle once compared a Democratic leader to a rider on a mad stallion, run amok in a forest. His main concern being not to accomplish anything in particular, but just to stay on the horse. If the analogy was apt for the likes of Palmerston, how much more so for George W. Bush? Of course, American presidents cannot be unseated by a vote of no confidence or a snap election, but one notices that when the presidential approval numbers slip below 30% or so, the White House loses any domestic influence it may have once had. The effect is about the same. The White House, that is, the faction elected along with the president, has some power. At least it had power in 2003, at least over military policy. And by force of ancient institutional habit, it strives constantly to equate everything it does with the person of George W. Bush. No one in Washington actually believes this, but no one bothers to contradict it either. It's just one of those beltway things. Anyway, I digress. Back to the Times. If there was one moment at which I realized how things actually worked in the country, it was sometime in 2000, courtesy of a woman I dated for a few years. Since I have nothing bad to say about her, I'll use her real name, Margot. Margot was about 7 years older than me, and she was more or less a Brahmin to end all Brahmins. She was an MD, an internist specializing in the many troubles of the homeless. At the same time, she was just coming off a stint as chief resident of UCSF. This is not a position that is easy to acquire. I believe she's now a research professor at the same institution. Also not a position that is easy to acquire. Obviously, I have no such credentials or ambitions, and Margot retains the distinction of being the only woman who has ever dumped me, a very sensible decision for which I'm quite grateful, as is Mrs. Moldbug, or so I hope. At the time, I had not quite developed my present extremist views, but I would not say I was taking the blue pills either. Since Margot's opinions were exactly as one might expect for a person in her line of work, this led to a number of animated conversations. I still believed, however, that the New York Times was presenting me with a basically accurate picture of current history. Of course, it was clear to me that all the reporters were Orthodox Universalists. Not that I use the term use that term, but I thought they could just read past their occasional devotional flourishes. This was kind of before the whole blog thing. And one day, the subject came up in an entirely different context. Margot was explaining to me how her research career worked. Obviously, the point is publishing, and they were different journals, which at least in her corner of the profession were commonly called by their colors. So the Journal of Endemic Gastroenterology might be the green journal, and the Journal of Unquenchable Sinus Infections the yellow journal, etc., etc. But said Margot, everyone's real goal is to get into the gray journal. This is one of those facts too strange to boggle the mind, whose only option is to accept it as an axiom. So to us, it is axiomatic that all these thousands of top-ranking scientists in the U.S., of course, Margot had a special political angle, being concerned with public health, but I pretty much guarantee you that any scientist in the world would trade any publication for a write-up in the Times, are doing pretty much anything that they can to get into the gray journal. Of course, they can't do much. You can't submit to the gray journal. There's no formal review process. You simply have to know someone who knows someone who was on the other end of this chain. 5 or 10 very ordinary people with no particular expertise in anything, perhaps a BA in some science or other, who happen to have gotten themselves assigned through whatever feat of bureaucratic mastery to the science beat at the Times. Yeah, I mean, I'll go with that. You know, it's who you know, and the people that are in the know are not people that really deserve to be there. Can you imagine having this job? Everyone in the universe wants to be your friend. Full professors, geniuses of historic consequence, writers of MacArthur grants, hacks, cranks, and crackpots of every description. Because you have some decency, you don't ask them to fall down and lick your shows, nor their souls. Lower, that's it. Nothing like genius spit for dissolving these nasty wads of gum, but let's face it, you could. Now, this is what Moldbug wants. He wants this really bad. Don't you think it's slightly strange that this handful of basically uneducated individuals essentially control science? That, for example, they could have written up the Wegman report and consigned global warming rightly or wrongly to the same category as cold fusion, N-rays, and Huang Wu suck. What do you think will happen in the first time they actually do make a mistake and get caught at it? And who even has the power to catch them? Well, in the digital age logos, we see that the people who control science are no longer the New York Times.
Wait a second. Say that again? The people who control what are no longer the New York Times?
Science.
Control science?
Yeah, because Moldbug is saying that science is controlled by the sort of like science op-ed writer for the New York Times, because they get to determine like what becomes popular.
Yeah, that's absolutely backwards. All the reporters cite studies, and so if there are no studies for them to cite, they have no ammunition for anything. I mean, we live in the age of technocracy now. I think it goes the other direction.
Yeah, well, we do live in the age of technocracy. I think even then we did.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and this is just science. For example, suppose you see an article about Israel on the front page of the Times with the byline, Stephen Erlinger. Perhaps there is one of these every few days, and no doubt if you put them together, they tell a story. But the one thing you guarantee not to read in the story is that one of the 10 most powerful people in Israel, maybe even one of the most 5, is Stephen Erlinger. I recommended a lot of old books, but let me switch gears and recommend a new one. Mark Moyer's revisionist history of the first half of the Vietnam War. What Moyer did was to go back through the archives and rewrite histories of the American correspondents in Vietnam were human participants in the story, not dispassionate angelic observers. It's really a remarkable read. There is a sense one gets when one reads a history in which some of the players have been airbrushed out. Oh, logos. You mean like Wall Street backing the Soviet Union? It's like being in a novel in which there's a poltergeist. Plates suddenly fly out of the cabinet and leap across the room to smash on the wall. Flying plates. Irresistible forces of historical destiny. When you say the same story with all the characters restored, and you realize that someone actually picked up the plate and threw it, you get this very comfortable feeling of reality returning. So I think we have a reasonable understanding of the level of power today's press has. What we haven't looked at is how it got that way. One fact that every American learns in high school is that there used to be something called yellow journalism. If a yellow journalism is with us today, it only exists in the sort of papers which no one of any quality reads, like the New York Post, the Daily Mail, or Jugs. Clearly, the New York Times would stand out on this list, so clearly it is not yellow journalism. It would certainly dispute the characterization, and I certainly agree. But in order to compare the two, we need a parallel terminology, so I humbly propose gray journalism for the latter. What is the difference between yellow journalism and gray journalism? Who invented gray journalism, when, and why? And is gray journalism which its practitioners call responsible journalism, objective journalism, and so on, best defined as official journalism? One interesting possibility is that the transition from yellow to gray journalism is identical to the transition from oclarchy to mediocrity. No, Logos, it's not interesting. Only Moldbug would think it's interesting. Under this theory, the grayification of journalism is a sort of Gleichschaltung. I'm not even going to say that. A coordination or alignment. Yellow journalism, such as that practiced by Hearst, Pulitzer, etc., uses political power to serve a variety of divergent private interests, which do not always coincide with the interests of the state. Gray journalism has learned its Hegelian manners and invariably serves and upholds the state. Well, Logos, if that's the distinction, that's completely bollocks. Because even in 2007, so many newspapers were serving like obviously private interests.
It's true. Yeah.
Obviously private interests. I mean, hey, Moldbug himself said that one eco website he didn't like was funded by some, megacorp. Huh. What do you know? It's just whatever. Of course, this does not mean it serves the government. It means that when the New York Times attacks the White House, it sincerely believes that it's supporting a nonpartisan watchdog in the public interest. I mean, why does Moldbug make all these excuses for people that he clearly hates?
I don't know. It's a good question. I bet you're going to tell us about it after a few more articles. You'll find a new narrative arc for Moldbug.
Probably. I'm still working on this. Apparently, the State Department never does anything wrong and thus never needs to be barked at. Perhaps this is because the state is a too nonpartisan agency, selflessly performing its difficult work of diplomacy in the public interest. Ladies and gentlemen, the Polygon. Regardless of whether or not this theory is true, one question we can ask about the transition between yellow and gray journalism is which is more powerful. We all know about Hearst starting the Spanish-American War. Most of us don't know that the Civil War journalism was even more heinous. With some of the things I've been reading, I'm starting to think the Civil War is best understood as a war between the northern and southern presses. So when this evil octopus of yellow journalism was finally defeated by its gray successor, did it lose power? Or did it pull an Obi-Wan Kenobi and become even more powerful than before? Wow. One way to measure this is to look at social attitudes towards reporters around the end of the yellow journalist era. Here, for example, is Lippmann from Public Opinion. The somewhat left-handed relationship between newspapers and public information is reflected in the salaries of newspapermen. Reporting, which theoretically constitutes the foundation of the whole institution, is the most poorly paid branch of the newspaper work and is least regarded. By and large, able men go into it only by necessity or for experience and with the definite intention of being graduated as soon as possible. For straight reporting is not a career that offers many great rewards. This is what I love about reading Lippmann. While he has his own agenda and is certainly not a trustworthy fellow, he is certainly describing the real world of 1922. You read these long passages in which he could be describing the real world of 2007 and then blam, you're on Mars. For straight reporting is not a career that offers many great rewards. Max Weber in his famous Politics of Vocation, is even more vehement the journalist situation in Germany in 1919. The journalist belongs to a sort of pariah caste, which is always estimated by society in terms of its ethically lowest representative. Hence, the strangest notions about journalists and their work are abroad. Not everybody realizes that a really good journalistic accomplishment requires at least as much genius as a scholarly accomplishment, especially because of the necessity of producing it once and on order, and because of the necessity of being effective, to be sure, under quite different conditions of production. It is almost never acknowledged that the responsibility of the journalist is far greater, and that this sense of responsibility of every honorable journalist is on the average not a bit lower than that of the scholar, but rather, as the war has shown, higher. This is because in the very nature of the cause, irresponsible journalistic accomplishments and their often terrible effects are remembered. Yet, the journalistic career remains under all circumstances one of the most important avenues of professional political activity. It is not a road for everybody, least of all for weak characters, especially for people who can maintain their inner balance only with secure status position. If the life of a young scholar is a gamble, still he is walled in by firm status conventions, which prevent him from slipping. But the journalist's life is an absolute gamble in every respect and under conditions that test one's inner security in a way that scarcely occurs in any other situation. This often bitter experiences in The often bitter experiences in occupational life are perhaps not even the worst. The inner demands that are directed precisely at the successful journalists are especially difficult. It is indeed no small matter to frequent the salons of the powerful on the earth on a seemingly equal footing, and often to be flattered by all because one is feared, yet knowing all the time that, having hardly closed the doors, the host has perhaps to justify before his guests his association with the scavengers from the press. Scavengers from the press. Today, there is absolutely no social context anywhere in the world where the presence of a Times reporter would not be a feather in the host's cap. We cannot even imagine the old pre-1914 society that held itself superior to the press. Again, Weber might as well be talking about Mars. Well, Logos, in a short 10 years, we had a crisis in journalism. What do you know?
Yep. Public trust the media is at an all-time low, Todd.
Oh, I know. I guess we're on Mars, Logos. I guess we're on Mars.
Wow, somebody better tell Elon Musk. He'll be really happy about that.
He will be. Moldbug should tell him. So Obi-Wan Kenobi is about right. Powerful as the yellow press was, the gray press appears to be even more powerful, at least judging by its social status. Note also that both Lippmann and Weber quite precisely see that this is a temporary misalignment of power, status, and power, and expect it to resolve in favor of the latter. But is gray journalism official? Can we use this word? After all, the New York Times company is a private company, just like Microsoft or McDonald's. Its journalists' independence is rigorously guarded, not just from the government, but even from the many parts of its own corporate hierarchy. Certainly no one is sending them emails telling them to write or not to write, whether it's the White House or the Democratic National Committee. This is really, as the phase official journalism implies, in a class with Pravda or the People's Daily. Another way to ask this question is, what is the minimal set of structural changes needed to make gray journalism unarguably official? And if we make these changes, have we created something totally different, or have we only made a few cosmetic modifications? First, we'll have to create a Department of Journalism. This will be an elite branch of the federal government with its own grade systems like the Foreign Service, only more elite. Ranks will follow the GS-SES system, but with a special J code for journalists. A senior journalist such as Stephen Erlinger might be hired as a J15, J School Dean, editors, and the like will carry the special JS rank, meaning simply senior journalists. The Department of Journalism will pull the entire mainstream media with all its features and appurtenances into the system. It will have 3 branches: training, reporting, and investigation, and editorial. Training will coordinate the journalists' schools. RI will align the new news desks from the existing newspapers and broadcasters. Editorial will develop opinion content for a diverse mix of political columnists, both Republican and Democrat, and so on. The critical question is, under this regime, which clearly qualifies as official journalism, how different would the job of a journalist be? I suspect the answer is not different at all. For example, it would be unthinkable for any other branch of government to tell RI what to write or how to write it. It would be like the White House ordering the Justice Department who to prosecute or how to prosecute them. Wah, wah. The last couple of years have shown that happens, Logos.
Yeah, yep, it's true.
Absolutely scandalous if discovered, and of course, no, absolutely scandalous if talked about. And of course, RI is right there to discover it. We usually think of independent journalism as a consequence of freedom of speech. Perhaps it's easier to say it as just another form of civil service protection. For example, the UK has something very close to a Department of Journalism. It's called the BBC. How different is the job of a BBC reporter from the job of a CNN reporter? Not very. For me, the reason I see journalism as official is that I think journalists are civil servants. Stators, we might say, in the rotary system. They have the same ethos of public service. They have the same protection from political interference. They are nonpartisan. They only serve the state. If you believe in the Hegelian apolitical civil service, you believe in official journalism. Of course, then, you have to explain what was so wrong with Brezhnevism, but that's another story. Moreover, the Department of Journalism is clearly one of the most powerful departments in the Western civil service state. A journalist can attack anyone, and no one can attack him except a judge, and then only in a limited set of ways that correspond to approving procedures, aka laws, which journalists have a great influence in designing. Unless the journalist gets attacked by digital technology and communications, in which case they have no defense, Logos. This is perhaps the most salient remaining difference between the post-communist civil service state as seen in China and increasingly in Russia and its Western cousin. In the post-communist system, power is in the hands of the security forces, who can command the journalists and the judges. In the Western system, it's the other way around. Whoa! I don't think so, Logos.
Don't think so. What? Sorry, say that again.
He says in the post-communist system, power is in the hands of the security services, so China and Russia, who can command the journalists and the judges. In the Western system, it's the other way around. Well, okay, maybe the judges can control the military. Well, theoretically control the military by, suing a soldier, but the journalists don't control the military.
Well, I think they're trying to make he's trying to make your point to a degree, right? When you said like, why is it that the U.S. lost in Vietnam? Well, their hands are kind of tied because of the certain things they were and weren't allowed to do.
Right.
And so what he's saying is journalism can make the military look so bad it can cause an international incident. So I wouldn't say it's more powerful, but it can certainly tie its hands in certain regards.
That's true. It can. And we saw this also in the War on Terror as well.
Yep.
Of course, as a Westerner, in the Western system, of course, as a Westerner, it's easy to see the advantages of our approach, but it's also interesting to look at who runs a trade deficit versus whom. So if all this is true, why do people believe this stuff? Why do they still read official journalism? Why, for example, do I visit NewYorkTimes.com on a regular basis? When I think back to when I thought I was getting an accurate history of reality from the Times, I am full of amazement. I mean, when you read the Times, you read stories that were written by people. Their names are right there. Stephen Erlinger, Don Van Natta, Andrew Revkin. Do I know these people? Do I trust them? Do I have any reason to believe they are doing anything but feeding me a mile-long crap sausage? Why should I? It's because they work for an organization called the New York Times. What do I know about this organization? How does it select its employees? How and why does the publisher reward them? Do I have any idea? If not, why do I trust its correct views on anything? Why not trust the Catholic Church instead? At least its officials make up cool names for themselves like Benedict XVI. Imagine if all Times reporters had to choose a pope name. Would this make them more or less credible? My conclusion is that people trust the Times and the rest of the official press, not despite the fact that they're basically reading Pravda, but because of it. But you see, this is also really strange, Logos, because again, I remember 2007. A lot of people believe that we were lied into Iraq. A lot of people.
Yep.
Like, what is he talking about?
I don't know, man.
Like, the New York Times was getting flack for quote-unquote leading us into Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
There was even a documentary called Weapons of Mass Deception.
Manufacturing consent.
And even before that, manufacturing consent, yeah. But Weapons of Mass Deception came out in 2002? Wow. No, it had to be after 2, but it talks about that too. The idea of... Yeah, I know. Keep going. We live in a world made by gray journalism. If you don't believe in gray journalism, you believe in nothing. You're a nihilist. Hey, there you go. He's owning it, Logos. He's owning it. He says he's a nihilist.
We are nihilist, Lebowski, if you believe in nothing.
I go to NewYorkTimes.com and I read a story about Pakistan. Does this Pakistan on the page have any resemblance to reality? Is there even a country called Pakistan? Once you deny gray journalism, you can deny anything. Your paranoia becomes unlimited. These days, I read the Times not because I think of it as true, but because the Times is the collective reality that, for better or for worse, most of the educated planet lives inside. I read the Times to know what the Times readers think of them are thinking, which is an atheist might read the Bible to know what Christians are thinking. While I'm revealing personal confidences, let me note that my stepfather, who certainly does not endorse this message, is actually a member of the CFR. Well, that's interesting, Logos. Isn't it?
What's a CFR again?
Council on Foreign Relations.
Oh, yeah. He already told us that, right? He's a son of diplomats. That makes sense.
Well, he didn't mention CFR, but yeah. He has a PhD in... Speaking of people that actually run the country, Logos.
Wait, what is a PhD in what?
No, I said, speaking of the people that actually run the country, he's got this tilting at windmills with the New York Times, but it's the CFR that pulls the strings.
Yeah, basically.
What is he talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, again, he's trying to deflect from the people that really call the shots. He has a PhD in politics from Harvard and was once a protege of McGeorge Bundy. And his story about the Times is that one day in the 60s, when there was a newspaper strike for several days, Bundy said something to the effect, "We've lost the best inter-office memo system we have." This is perhaps the best way to think of the Times and of the official press as a whole. It tells you what the state is thinking, which is currently a sufficient reason to read it. Of course, if journalism is official, we have to be able to illustrate it. If you agree with me that this system is thoroughly pernicious and that the state should not be managing the minds of its citizens, how do we get rid of it? I have many bad things to say about the U.S. system of corporate regulation. Oh, I bet he does, Logos. I bet he does. But sometimes it turns out a real gem. One such rule, a really well-designed law, is a little thing called Reg FD. The FD stands for fair disclosure, and the impact of the law is that when public corporations disclose information, they must disclose everything to everyone at the same time. My view is that an uncorrupt 21st century government should adopt its own version of Reg FD. No government has any good reason to practice or allow any kind of selective disclosure. When the state releases information, it should release to everyone at the same time without according to any privilege to journalists. This has a larger impact than you might think. Almost every press story you'll see is either A, a rewritten press release, a practice even the scavengers of the press find degrading, or B, a product of selective disclosure by some government or other. Well, there's actually a third one, Logos, if you do actual investigative journalism. And back in the 2000s, and back in the aughts, there were a lot of investigative journalists.
Oh, yeah.
So he forgot C. The practice of taking off the record or even downright leaking to journalists is widespread and uncontrolled, despite the fact that it's generally illegal. The result is a very complicated power relationship between journalists and the civil servants, who are the sources and contacts. Each is using the other. The journalist wants a story. The civil servant wants a story that contains certain information and is told in a certain way. There is plenty of room for compromise and quid pro quo. Every time I read some piece of investigative journalism in the Times, I have one question which is never answered. Why is the story being told? How did it happen? How did the events come to the attention of the author? For some reason, this is never in the text. True, but there's two ways you could look at this question, right? One is conspiratorially, that people are intentionally shaping a false view of the world, and I think that's certainly the case with modern media. But there's also a more fundamental problem, because you can't literally cover everything. You're going to have to choose certain things not to cover. Now, by making that choice, you're not necessarily being conspiratorial.
That's true, but I think there is some kind of a minor principle of sufficient reason here, right? Any story you cover is a contingent fact, so what's the explanation for this one?
That's true. I mean, I'm not saying that the New York Times isn't corrupt. But
obviously.
But I'm just saying that making that choice necessarily doesn't entail you're corrupt. That's all I'm saying. So, compare this to the work of a genuinely free reporter such as Michael Totten. Totten, because he is not institutionally attached and thus is unofficial, simply cannot participate in these kinds of relationships. Nor does he have an inter-office memo credibility. His voice is simply his own, and he tells, his own, and he tells us how he gets his stories. And his only tools for convincing us are his words and his pictures, and he succeeds. If the Times and Totten disagree, I simply assume the latter is right and the former is snowing me. Your mileage, of course, may vary. This species of journalism deserves its own color as well, and I will take the liberty of suggesting my own favorite, orange. Orange journalism is any writing about current history which does not depend on any official credibility and is not filtered or authorized by anyone. It has only its own voice to create and maintain a trust. The Exile is another fantastic example of orange journalism. I don't know that I can trust Ames, Dolan, and Co. as much as Totten, but I sure as hell trust them more than The Economist. Imagine if Stephen Ehrlinger quit the job at the Department of Journalism and started a blog, competing with Michael Totten on his Middle East beat. What would it take for me to trust him the way I trust Totten? One heck of a lot. So why should I trust him more now just because he works for the man? I don't. And I don't think anyone else should either. Losing your faith in official journalism is an extremely large mental step. It's really in the category of giving up a religion. It creates an enormous set of questions which you thought were answered, and now suddenly are questions again. And it's very easy to get those questions wrong. To paraphrase Chesterton, when people stop believing in the Times, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. So If you're not sure you're prepared for this step, perhaps the safest and most sensible option is to just keep reading the official press. But put the whole thing off for a year or two. Reality doesn't go away. When you're ready for it, it'll still be there. 1, as Moldbug notes in his comments on Is Journalism Official, is in fact a cable modem does modulate and demodulate, but the point remains that it would likely be called a modem regardless. 2, although responsible journalism generally refers to the ethical principle that journalists should act responsibly, that matters mainly because irresponsible journalism has the power to do harm. Well, yeah, we're not doing this. Not at this point. All right, Logos. When you got anything to say about all this?
Nah, I don't think there was a whole bunch of big narrative highlights to talk about in these articles. I mean, one was a continuation of the stuff we already talked about last time. He was sparring with his readers. I mean, one thing to take from that is that his readers were kind of on the same page we were as far as the criticisms they were making. Some of the libertarians, not so much. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting. He did kind of give clues in that article, more clues, as if we needed more, about his views about power versus principles, which people are up in arms about the interview that happened recently with him. The next thing about the journalism, I never got a compelling answer about what to do with the Polygon if a new government takes power. The answer he gave is basically like, we'll retire them from their old perches and they can go write a new blog or something somewhere. But it's like, if it's a public spectacle, that's what's being done, then all the people who thought they were the real journalists are going to go where the new real journalists go and follow them again. I mean, it's not really going to change anything. That the influence will still remain. Nothing's really going to get done. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that, I mean, the real problem is, like, the other problem too is, what are you going to do about the financial donors, right? That are propping these things up and making them as good as they are. I mean, you've got people that can make Candace Owens or Charlie Kirk or whoever become, go from niche YouTube stars to leading college campus rebellions and, millions and millions of funding for their organizations and so on. Like, they can do it to anybody they want to do it to. And Moldbug has no solution for that. He can't, because he's a libertarian, basically. The best Moldbug's going to get is, well, these rich people backing these successful things should be the ones in charge if the new government takes over. But the problem is, these people are backing the people Moldbug doesn't like. So the last thing he's going to want them to do is be in charge. That'll just be more of the same. I mean, they'll have more responsibility, but ultimately they're not going to get anything done that Moldbug would like to see in government. And the problems that undermine their rule now will undermine their rule later when they're just formally in charge. So it's not gonna do a lot. The last couple where he's talking about, like, his wife or his ex-girlfriend, the researcher,
journalism,
in the journalism one, I didn't get much from that. I think the view he has of journalism is a little backwards, but I didn't see anything too noteworthy there.
Me too. It was just a filler. So we'll just end with this lovely quote from Paul Moosefoot. Insofar as Moldbug goes, I think he just speaks gobbledygook, reminds you of the rationalists or something. Or does he mean liberalists? I'm not sure. Weirdos. POF and Logos speak clearly with brevity much better. So there you go, Logos. There you go.
Well, thanks much, Paul.
So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.